Imagining action in, against the Anthropocene, narrative impasse and the necessity of alternatives to effect resistance. I researched and wrote this paper in Impasse on the territory of Treaty 6, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others, whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence this land and its peoples. I would also like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for their support in providing the funds by which I was able to pay rent and eat for the duration of researching and writing this article. I argue in my article that the hallmark narrative of the Anthropocene is that the political has become personal and, more than that, a personal imperative. The conceptual framework of the Anthropocene funnels an incredible complexity of intersecting issues into an individualistic refrain. Disempowered and distracted by the 24-hour news cycle, conscientious individuals can easily be led to believe that the fate of the world rests on their shoulders alone. Collective political mobilization to combat environmental problems, such as in the case of the Montreal Protocol, seems a distant and almost unimaginable action in the present day. There seems little that I can do alone, but the multitude of negative forces that are tearing at the fabric of the world. As Martin Lukács writes for The Guardian, quote, "While we busy ourselves greening our personal lives, fossil fuel corporations are rendering those efforts irrelevant," unquote. Lukács articulates this as the result of a quote-unquote ideological war, wherein a neoliberalist mindset has, over the latter half of the 20th century, dismantled walls barring the exercise of corporate power, at the same time as rendering collective democratic action by citizens, quote-unquote, unthinkable. The concept of the Anthropocene constitutes a significant psychological impasse that requires the exploration of alternative narratives in order to realize meaningful resistance to it. This presentation is a shortened version of a longer argument attempting to do two things. First, to unravel and understand the Anthropocene as a multiplicity of narratives disguised as a singular concept. And second, to consider the genre of solarpunk as containing tangible and attainable multiple alternative narratives of sustainable, just futurity. I do this by analyzing T.X. Watson's short story, The Boston Heart Project. It is becoming increasingly obvious that many societies are living the outcomes of their imaginative inabilities, as the dystopic Earth predicted by so many science fiction narratives, in film and text, looms as an inevitability so ingrained into our vision of the future that we fail to be shocked by its arrival. Enter solarpunk, a category of narratives that contains the potential to combat the overwhelming despair instilled by the Anthropocene, manifesting across a range of different media, including art, political activism, community organizing, and literature. Solarpunk combines an Art Nouveau aesthetic with a science fictional implementation of green technologies, most notably solar, but also wind, wave or tide, and geothermal energy generation. And that is its first basic component. I'm quoting here from a blog post made by Tumblr user Miss Olivia Louise, which is linked in this PowerPoint. The second component of solarpunk, that of socio-political and economic revolution, is the genre's acknowledgement of the many different fronts on which it is necessary to combat the issues of the contemporary moment in order to create a positive future for all beings that qualifies it as a viable alternative imaginary to empower humans in the midst of the so-called Anthropocene. Solarpunk can be found as the tradition of science fiction's critical interrogation of the status quo of the future, even before it has come to pass, as not merely proposing a swap of the fossil fuel-based economy of the present for an economy based on greener energy technologies, such as solar or wind, but further exploring the ramifications of significant social change for all planetary life in order to fully imagine more realistic and just futures. Writer Rob Cameron notes that despite this, solarpunk still has much to do to break from its parent genre of science fiction's definition by, and perpetuation of, Western patriarchal norms and mindset and find, quote, a solid connection with the underrepresented groups it's meant to include, unquote. Cameron argues that solarpunk needs to detach itself from Western utopic aspirations if it is to be truly committed to anti-racism, as the Western utopian urge historically and presently generates dystopia in real time for marginalized and oppressed groups worldwide. In my article, I go on to analyze the short story The Boston Hearth Project by T.X. Watson as an example of a story that mobilizes many of the key themes of solarpunk in its narrative, such as community, extra-legal action driven by empathy, valuing human individuals, and infrastructure as resistance, and depicts an assemblage of humans navigating a small corner of the Anthropocenic world with care. The story focuses on main character Andy's description of homeless advocates' break-in and illegal occupation of the Hale Center, a smart building in downtown Boston in the year 2022. Andy contextualizes the takeover as a response to the increasing rate of winter deaths of homeless people in Boston due to the intensifying winters of climate change and the city's non-response to it, even closing 2 shelters in the past 5 years. The way that political inaction is responsible for the situation of society's poorest members is the driving motivation of the short story. Watson's depictions of transparent solar panels, advanced silent drone technology, ad hoc wireless networks, giant tanks of algae used as indoor water filters and oxygen scrubbers, and self-sustainable smart buildings are certainly necessary to set the scene, but are not in themselves what gives the protagonist and their collaborators their impetus. Importantly, the Hale Center itself is an active participant in the occupation. The activists use its temperature regulation and automatically locking doors to trap and disarm police in riot gear. After hours at heightened temperatures, the police are made to discard their armor and arms and are sent away unharmed. In the article, I elaborate on solarpunk's attentiveness to issues of justice, equity, and equal access, as well as its development since 2008 in the tradition of the speculative genre, and its differences and similarities to generic forebears such as cyberpunk and climate fiction, or cli-fi. I also make a larger argument about solarpunk as an intentionally affirmative movement, which seems to respond to and embody feminist philosopher Rosie Briotti's call to mobilize theory beyond negativity. It is not enough to be against. Solarpunk is a genre born of the system that it seeks to dismantle and lives in the tension, giving us imaginative tools to resist the isolating individualism of neoliberal thought as Lukács articulates it. I draw further on Braidotti, but also on the theory of feminist posthumanist scholar Stacey Alaimo, and show that solarpunk thinking can equip people mentally to resist the narrative of the Anthropocene that seeks to mire us in guilt, despair, and, ultimately, inaction. Imagining a course of action and way of life outside the limits of the Anthropocene discourse is vitally necessary to develop the ability to stage meaningful resistance to the forces of neoliberal capitalism and the consumer culture which is driving the degradation of the planet and the extinction of more than human life. Writers and scholars such as Heather Albero, Cameron, Jennifer Hamilton, and Rhys Williams have noticed that an exploration of the solarpunk genre can aid in developing the cognitive capacity to picture positive futures. Expanding our imagination of the future to include the ability to picture oneself contributing to the development of an environment that both sustains and is sustainable can grant resisting citizens the ability to forge communities in which the actions of each individual count towards the much larger and effective actions of a significant group. It is important, therefore, for solarpunk to source as much of its ideology, theory, and methods from multiple sources, especially from movements such as feminism, Afrofuturism, indigenous futurisms, and non-Western and queer political and speculative writings. Collective power can then be used effectively in order to lobby local, provincial, and federal governments on behalf of the climate, or to invest in sustainable technologies, or to disrupt the systemic racism, or to demand justice for Indigenous peoples, or to set up alternative ways of living altogether. In closing, I would like to make clear that I'm not holding up solarpunk alone as an alternative to anthropocenic despair, since alternatives to the restrictive Anthropocene narrative of isolation can be found in many instances of community solidarity and group action, no matter how small. Better stories about the future can be found in the actions of groups organizing for immigrant and Indigenous rights, protesting income disparity and massive debt, and movements targeting racism, misogyny, and homophobia in the workplace, schools, cities, and governments worldwide. The prominent Anthropocene worldview is both isolating and deeply disempowering, relying on a version of independence that is self-castigating and self-ostracizing. Instead, we need imaginative expansion that is positive and recognizes the web of relationality that constitutes the human subject at any given time, insistent on the fact that one is never not in relation with their surroundings, and consequently not alone.